Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video view series. We take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. This video will be reviewing the campaign, The Legacy of Zandrax, Parts 1 and Part 2, designed by Danny Kodicek for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my content, consider using my affiliate links for your online shopping and supporting me via patreon.com/roguewatson. This is a rare 2-in-1 review. The publisher has given me the first 2 parts of what I presume are going to be additional parts because this campaign does not end after Part 2. And initially I thought, okay, is this like a Pathfinder adventure path where it's episodic, but each one still contains kind of a beginning, middle, and end? No, it is not that. And in fact, probably the biggest flaw of this campaign, and it is a campaign, is the lack of organization. It doesn't really have a synopsis or an overview, and the fact that we're given, it's almost like somebody just took, like Storm King's Thunder, and then it's like, okay, what if the first 2 chapters were released here, and then chapters 3 and 4 released here, and then chapters 5 and 6 are still coming soon? Like, there's no real beginning, middle, and end. It's just, this is clearly a full campaign that was just cut up into multiple chapters. So that's kind of unfortunate. I believe Part 1 is technically pay what you want on DM's Guild, and then the second one is paid. So maybe you could treat it as like, here's the, almost like a mobile game thing where it's like, here's the demo version, and then you can unlock further content. But it's awkward the way it's placed in there, and even more awkward because it doesn't even like necessarily end on a cliffhanger or anything. Well, like these are just, it's a continuation. And in fact, the first part, which is this one, Part 1, Adventures in Eastwick, a solid chunk, probably about half of this product is like open world descriptions of like, here's the region you're in, and now here's all the, it's like that, I think it's chapter 3 in Storm King's Thunder, where it's like, here's all the different things you can go and explore. In other words, it doesn't really advance the main quest or the story at all. It's just immediately starts off, you get a really cool inciting incident, and then there's this big open world. And I assume this campaign starts at level 1. It's that poorly organized where it doesn't even list like, what are the levels, what is the overall like plot and synopsis. It does have a very cool background where you can tell the designer had a really cool story plan for here, and it's a very cool inciting incident. It's really, really fun. That's basically what this cover depicts, which is you're in a bar and all of a sudden the door opens and there's a dying beholder standing there with a couple drow that it's mind controlled, and it's got this, which I think beholders spawn via like dreaming themselves up and into existence or something. But in this case, in this world, which I don't know if this is Forgotten Realms or not, it's got all the D&D characters and races and things, but it's growing this other like beholder spawn as one of its eyes, and it's dying. The other spawn does get born in that instant, and it basically bequeaths this quest onto the players by spitting up this drow amulet, which has a chance to banish Lolth, the demon queen, the big bad goddess of the drow, before he expires. So the Legacy of Zandrax is cursing one of the players with this amulet, which has a lot of power, but also makes you a huge target. And then you get this little baby beholder that like follows you around. It can turn itself invisible at will. You can basically tell the player some information. It's a really amazing inciting incident that really kicks things off for a story, gets the players directly involved in like what is going on. It's a really neat use of a beholder to like throw it, again, presumably level 1 players. And I absolutely love this entire opening. The problem is, there's no, easy synopsis. There's no beat by beat like, hey, here's what we think you should do for level 1, here's level 2, here's level 3, here's the different paths the players can take to get from, this beginning of the story to this end. It doesn't have any of that in this introduction. Instead, you're basically in this town. You get the amulet and then the beholder baby, whose name is Livian, and you're told to your next step is to go to this next, basically the one big city in the region. And then chapter 1 is all just open world exploration, which is kind of cool, and it's something I don't really see that out, because usually when you get a DM's Guild adventure, they're very linear. They're not quite maybe Adventurers League tiny, but some of for the most part they're 30, 40 pages, if that, and it's pretty linear about here's chapter 1, here's the events, and they just go in order, and that's that. In this case, this entire first chapter is just all these different areas you can explore in this region. So if you look on this map here, every single town every single noted geographical location, and all these little circles that, like, say, Cloud Wall, Lizard Folk Lair, Mist Bridge, Ankeg Nest, those are all little, like, dungeons and side quests. Like, it really is like an open world RPG at that point, where you get all these, like, you know, areas of interest that you can go and explore, and a lot of them do have dungeons associated with them, like multi-room dungeons, and we get full color maps. Now, these are not the sexiest map style art. In fact, they're pretty basic, but they are better than the black and white, you know, Dice and Logos maps that I see time and time again. So I will always give a thumbs up to these kind of maps, even if they're not the most attractive kind of color maps. They're still very good. We do get these as player versions, but I think they're still embedded in the PDF at the end. I don't believe we get separate zip files that are bigger resolution, but I was given these as a direct email and not through the DM's Guild, so I'm not 100% sure on that. But there's some cool dungeon mini things in here. There's the giant ant nest, which has been taken over by a mating pair of onk eggs. There are some standing stones that you can do this crazy ritual of that summons these ghostly termites that teleports you to a pocket space maintained by tiny modron, like insect things, that keep this aboleth in this like pocket dimension prison, which is really cool. There's a geyser that erupts every couple minutes, but you can try to run in and grab some diamonds. There's an orc fort taken over by a green dragon. There's an old barrow as a bandit hideout who scares people away, but if blood... They scare people away by putting a bunch of like traps and things and making it seem like it's haunted. But if blood is actually spilled in their lair, then it actually does summon a wraith, so it turns out it really is haunted. I'm going over all these things because this is just a ton of content. There's over 20 pages of all of this content of just open world exploration. None of it, well, some of it is technically kind of maybe a little bit main story related. There's one point where there's a shield guardian that kidnaps a scholar. You actually see that happen in part 2. You see the results of that, so you could tease that earlier. At one point, you can meet with a unicorn who can kind of point to the amulet and get more information on it and maybe tell you some things. So there is a bit more, and it'll say, yeah, including like here, the Shifting Labyrinth, the area described in Chapter 3. Like, it's telling you, again, kind of like Storm King's Thunder, where these things that are more important are given their own chapters that are maybe more part of the main quest. But that's really nuts. Like, that's a lot of content information, and for the most part, it's pretty interesting and cool. And then the next chapter is the big town of Morton, which, again, not the most attractive map, but at least we get a map, which is nice. And here the players can meet the magistrate and get some more information about how they should handle having this, you know, important artifact that, by the way, is cursing the player who's been afflicted with it to where they basically slowly, I was going to say evolve and devolve maybe, into a drider, like a half-spider person. And it's to where if they fail a number of saves every like day or every so often, they literally start transforming, which... mixing an open world campaign with a ticking time bomb clock doesn't usually mix very well, because it's the same problem that Tomb of Annihilation has if you follow that plot line where it's the curse is slowly killing people, and then you give them this big hex crawl. It's like, oh yeah, go explore, have fun, and, you know, go treasure hunting. But it's like, well, no, we've got to like solve the main quest. We got to get on this. So I do have a problem with that whenever a game introduces a time constraint to the overall entire plot and then says, oh, but here's this whole big fun world you can explore. Like, the two usually don't mix very well. I really like the way that, I don't know if this is supposed to be set in the Forgotten Realms, but it feels like it's very realmsy, and yet it uses other races in a cool way. Like, drow are not automatically hunted and killed. There's a group of drow that live in this town, like in this southern region, and yeah, they mostly only come out at night because they still have their, you know, sunlight sensitivity, but they've forsaken, you know, Lolth, and in this case, a lot of these drow worship this giant mummified spider, which they mummified so they can worship it longer, called Lady Poison, I think. And these are basically the good drow, but it adds a lot of interesting like political and racial overtones where, you know, nobody really fully trusts these drow, and of course some of the drow might be falling into old ways, and others are wanting to work with people, and it's just a lot of cool like you know, political things you can get into with the players. And you know, the Chapter 1 had all of that open world stuff and all of these encounters. Chapter 2 also has all of these encounters and little like side quest adventure hooks you could pick up, even though the designer even says, you know, this is really just a hub town. The players are used to go off and do other things. They're not really meant to adventure in the town itself, but if they want to, here's all this content that you can do, which is really nice to have. So again, we get all this extra content and encounters for just the town itself, which is amazing. Now here's the problem. That's where part 1 ends. Part 1 ends with the players, if they're just following the main quest, which again, that person is afflicted with this like demon drow amulet that slowly transforms them into a drider, then they just make it across the region to the next town, maybe doing barely any of the open world stuff, make it to town, and then that's the end of part 1. There's no real like end to it at all, even though we get all these cool locations and backstory and basically all the region building for this area. So to get that, you actually have to go to part 2, which is here, The Legacy of Zandrax Part 2, which continues the main story in basically 2 big dungeon crawls, which are both freaking amazing. Like, it's so weird how there's so much of the way this adventure is structured and designed and laid out is so frustrating to me, and it has such deep flaws, and yet it does so many things so well and has such really cool ideas that it's the most mixed I've ever been, like conflicted I've ever been in a review in terms of do I like this or do I not like this. I think overall I like it because every time it pulls me back, there's something it does that sucks me right back in. For example, for the confusion of the organization. So part 2, there's the introduction, by the way. It's basically like, I hope you read part 1, even though it says you could do this without part 1. Notice how in part 1, there's a chapter 1 and a chapter 2, right? So chapter 1 was the open world, and then chapter 2 is the town, Morton. And then part 2 starts off with chapter 2. So this is clearly an error, and I believe it's even an error when you look at the introduction because it says chapter 3, the Shifting Labyrinth, when it says chapter 2, the Shifting Labyrinth, and then it does chapter 3, the Sunken Library. So there's a little bit of issue here with how it's organized. As I think overall it's got organizational issues, but also just dumbass typo errors and things that really should have been not included at all and fixed immediately. So in this case, the next big thing in the main quest is to help Livian, which is the beholder spawn, because she's got, and yes, she identifies as she apparently, information the players have that they need. Basically, they need follow-up information that the dying beholder couldn't give them, but she wants a layer of her own so she can grow into a full beholder, which is a neat idea. And this dungeon that she kind of picks out, which is nearby the town, is an incredibly cool, like, Rubik's Cube ziggurat that shifts gears. It reminded me a lot of some of the best ideas of the Tomb of the Nine Gods in the Tomb of Annihilation campaign, especially like the rotating gears room, where it's literally the entire thing rotates. And in this case, it's the entire dungeon that rotates around. The players have to get all these different keys and have to be able to rotate, and only by rotating can they even access other areas of the dungeon. It's just it reminded me of a giant Rubik's Cube, the way that the thing turns around. Like, it's a really, really cool idea. Really fun. It's infested with troglodytes. It's meant to be very low level. In fact, we just read 40 pages of part 1, and this one starts off with, oh yeah, the players are probably level 2, maybe they're level 1. Like, what? So you didn't even... Okay, fine. So we're still very low level. You assume the players are just doing the main quest, and I guess not doing a lot of the open world side quest stuff. But this is still a very, very cool dungeon. It's a really neat idea, and this is part when I said, when I got through part 1, I was like, wait, that's it? Where does part 2... Like, how does this... The organization is so frustrating, like the structure, and you show me this dungeon, I'm like, this is such a cool dungeon. I love this idea. It's such a neat design. It's got these cool like puzzles the players has to solve. It's a little complicated, but hopefully if you're not too obtuse about it, the players can have fun with it, and they don't do it. It's not a big like damagey thing like the Tomb of the Nine Gods is. This again supposed to be like a level 2 dungeon. It's pretty low. There's some traps. It's infested with a few troglodytes, but otherwise they're supposed to just have fun, like turning this thing around and really figuring things out. But it's pretty complicated, but I think in a really cool way. So you could just take that whole dungeon and put it somewhere in your campaign. I think it would be very, very cool. Here's where it pulls me back out again, here at the end. So there's a cool boss fight with a helmed horror that's slightly tweaked because you don't want to necessarily fight a helmed horror at level 2. And then you get a bunch of treasure, and then the little beholder baby, which has been probably a fun NPC companion, because how often do you get a little beholder baby to follow you around? It can turn invisible at will. It's got a couple of its eye rays. It helps the players because it sees them as its minions and things. Just absolutely phenomenal idea for a little party NPC ally mascot thing. And then you get to the end, and it's like, oh, thank you for giving me this layer. I will now give you this information, which is good information. Basically, it's the entire backstory that frankly, the Dying Beholder should have told you, which is what happened. A lot of it was in part 1 that the DM knows, which is this beholder took over the drow, and then the drow were able to summon Lolth, basically, and use that to move out the beholders. The beholder says, okay, now the drow have all this power. We need to go, blah, 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 blah. there's a lot going on there, and they learn all this information, and then she just says, all right, now fuck off. I'm going to become a real beholder now, and this is going to be my dungeon. Now you got the information. I was so disappointed in this because I really loved the idea of that little baby beholder as Livian, as a just memorable, fun NPC companion that should have stuck with the players for a while at least, and not immediately lose her in the very first main quest dungeon to the end, where she tells you all this information and says, okay, I'm gonna go do my thing now. Our deal is complete. Like that. Don't do that. That was such a cool idea. That's such a nice NPC to give them, that could have been used in so many interesting ways, and yet we're going to lose them immediately. So I was very disappointed in that. As much as I love this dungeon, I didn't like that story development very much. And then chapter 3 leads them to basically gathering more information about, this amulet, and now they've got the backstory. Now they need to kind of know how they can, get rid of it and what they need to do. It leads them to a swamp, which is, of course, home to a lot of bullywugs. It's kind of a hex crawl in here with a bunch of encounters. There's a green hag who's posing as like a bullywug or a human, as green hags can do, and sowing a lot of discontent and things. And she's got a whole huge like boss battle of things she can do. She can summon ghouls, and there's giant lizards that guard her hut and all this thing. Eventually, it wants to lead them to a sunken library, which is, again, a really cool dungeon design. This thing is underwater. You can't get to it unless you help the bullywugs with their hag problem. And it's got this dome over it. You get through the dome, and it's like this alien structure where there's air, down there. There's this huge 250-foot shaft with dual helix invisible spiral staircases that you can go up and down, which of course is terrifying to just try and, go down there and without seeing anything. And then at the bottom is filled with a bunch of oozes. There's a, which is what the cover's shown, which is this bone naga trapped in this force field. She's got control of a shield guardian that used the shield guardian to capture a scholar, and the scholar's looking through the library to try to figure out how she can get out there. The library is full of Yuan-Ti who are doing Yuan-Ti shit. So the shield guardian's there in the library with that scholar, and the players can meet him, and suddenly they're trying to now work for the bone naga. It's just a really cool dungeon with a lot going on. Again, and then once they complete that, they defeat the Yuan-Ti, and you free the Naga, then the dome shatters, and the entire area starts filling with water, which means, A, you've got some time, but not a lot of time, before this whole area fills up with water, and B, all the oozes down here in number 4 start squeezing back up into that shaft, creating a potentially hilariously amazing and memorable dungeon egress when you try to leave this flooded shaft dungeon that's got oozes coming out from the bottom. Holy shit, what a cool idea. And on top of all that, to get the information they need, they have to actually go to the library, go through books, and like get teleported into this like other dimension where they fight this bookworm thing, which has been eating a bunch of books and stories, and that's how they get all this information, is by defeating this entity. It's just incredibly cool dungeon design that it's really, really well done and very interesting. I'm kind of lost on the main quest a little bit, except that you're supposed to be gaining this just keep gaining this information. So you kind of lose, I just feel like you lose that like exciting incident that happened in the beginning with the dying beholder and the cursed amulet and all that. And then it's just a whole bunch of information gathering the whole time. There's not like a lot of good key, which is why I like that beholder baby so much. There's not a lot of good key NPCs involved. It's just a lot of just the players going around gathering information. And maybe that's the problem I have with open world RPGs versus more narratively focused RPGs. And most of what I run and what I'm used to is the latter. I'm really not used at all to running open world. Like, yes, I give and I've done a whole hex crawl, but you still, you point your players to certain locations and they go there and check them out. It's not a question of just giving them a full map, giving them like 20 locations and saying, okay, now, here's whatever. And then at some point you'll figure out how to, advance the main quest and get more information along the way. So maybe that's just why I'm a little bit more turned off of the actual main quest, because it's not a style of adventure or campaign that I necessarily like to run. That being said, I think these are still very, very cool dungeon designs and ideas here. And the problem is, that's the end of part 2. It doesn't end. Like, the campaign is still not ended yet. You get the information now, and it says, like, your next stops are, you could go to the temple directly and try to take on, all the drow and things, or you could try to look up this silver dragon who's now transformed into a human and kind of forsaken, being a dragon and everything, and he's got this mystical artifact that you could try to grab. It's got these different paths you can take, but that's all we get. So presumably there's a part 3 coming that will hopefully wrap this thing up. And I would be interested in checking it out just to see, again, what are some really cool dungeon designs that the designer is going to give me, because holy crap, these have been really nice so far. But this whole thing still has some very, very deep flaws involved that are very frustrating to me. I mean, the font's very tiny. There's not a whole lot of artwork. It's organized very, very poorly. There's just so many cons and flaws, and yet I can't help but think that this might be a little bit of a diamond in the rough situation, where it's got some very rough edges, but it also has some really, really neat ideas and a ton of content, even just looking at these first 2 parts. In fact, even just that first part, if you're not going to run the campaign, but you just want some neat, like, ideas for little side quests and things, that part 1 had a wealth of information alone, and this one would be well enough to run dungeons. In fact, and JVC Perry has done this on his campaigns, it might not be a bad idea for the designer to actually take some of these dungeons and sell them separately and just be like, hey, here's the Shifting Labyrinth dungeon as an idea, and here are different adventure hooks. You could do this as a drop-in dungeon. I think the dungeons are that good and have that are that well designed and have that good of ideas that they could be sold separately as modular dungeons. It still could fit in the context of this campaign, but that would be something that I would look at doing if I was that good at making dungeons like this. All right, let's go over my pros and cons for Legacy of Zandrax. Pros: memorable and creative adventure hook with a dying beholder and a cursed amulet. Absolutely amazing initial inciting incident that immediately drew me into this adventure and made me stand up and be like, oh, well, this is interesting. That's not how usually adventures start. And in fact, it's a full campaign. It does lose its steam almost immediately afterwards, but that's still a really cool introduction. Pro: Chapter 1 includes over 20 pages of open world exploration, including multiple dungeons and quests. That is a wealth of content, even though the main quest comes to a grinding halt, which is always the problem when you're running an open world RPG. You just can't quite keep that narrative up. The way you do that is by creating all these different quest chains and factions and things. This doesn't necessarily do that, but it does have a decent job of like, hey, here's just some nice, fun side content you can do, including ones that have their own little dungeons and, again, interesting ideas throughout for sure. Pro: full color maps for dungeons, towns, and regions. Not my favorite map style, but they are color maps, and I will always appreciate that, including the regions. And anything that's bigger than, not every single area has a map, like that Aboleth prison that's got all the Modrons and these infinite corridors. That's not really mapped, but the ones that are more traditional dungeon crawls do have maps, and I appreciate that. And pro: fantastic dungeon design, specifically with the Shifting Labyrinth and the Sunken Library. Basically, the content in part 2 has just absolutely incredible ideas, really, really neat structure to them. A lot of like NPCs, a great balance of social exploration and combat. The way to my heart is really through a good dungeon crawl, and holy shit, this has really good dungeon crawls. Cons: it is awkwardly divided into multiple parts and still not concluded after part 2. And it's not like an adventure path where it's like, here's a beginning, middle, and end, and now we're going to part 2, and here's the beginning, middle, and end, and now we're going to part 3. Instead, it's just like somebody took a regular, D&D size campaign book and just chopped it up into multiple pieces, presumably 3, I would think. I think you'd be able to end it with a third one, another 2 chapters. And it just doesn't really work. It doesn't feel very well. You kind of have to have all these things together to make the story, and it just feels like, not to bemoan it too much, but it really feels like a nickel and diming thing, where it's like, all right, you got the sampler, now you need to buy the whole thing in order to experience the entire product. Con: it lacks organization, including synopsis and overview. The fact that I didn't even know what level this was for when I started. I didn't know what all the content was there. It would have helped to have some kind of adventure overview, not necessarily the Adventurers League thing of the bubbles pointing one to the other, but just something to let me know, like, where is this going? What are the steps the players are going to have to take? And all the information. Instead, I just get the background to like what the villains were doing, and then we just move right into the inciting incident, and I just have no idea where the story's going, or how long it is, or what the levels ranges are, any of that information. Con: open world adventure plus ticking clock, in this case the form of that cursed item that slowly turns your players into a goddamn drider, don't mix very well, and that's for the same reason as Tomb of Annihilation's Death Curse. Here's the stuff right here where it transforms into a drider. The Amulet of Lolth. It's, if you're punishing your players for taking too long, then you can't also reward them for exploring all these other like areas, because it really just fucks over that one player, especially if they're the one that's saddled with this curse. They're gonna be like, no guys, we need to get on the main quest. And everybody's like, let's explore and have fun. Like, it doesn't work very well. And con, this is a very personal con for me, but I loved the Beholder Baby. I thought it was a wonderful party NPC. It was such a fun idea. I like the way it's written, where she like stays invisible most of the time and kind of jacks with the players a little bit, but is also a little bit on their side. And you know, treats them like minions and slaves, obviously. And she should have stuck around a bit longer, at least a little bit longer, rather than literally have it resolved within the very next, basically, chapter in the very next dungeon. And she's just like, "All right, I'm done." Like, "Oh, come back, Livy." And that was such a fun idea. Final verdict: despite its deep organizational flaws, The Legacy of Zandrax is a promising campaign with a huge amount of content, fascinating dungeon designs, and interesting new takes on classic D&D creatures. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can watch more reviews and follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. You can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson. Shoutouts to Platinum patrons Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Manuel, Wizard, Princess, Christopher, Thomas, Captain Mike, Adam, Aiden, Instant Lose, Smog, and Roger. And gold patrons RPG Papercrafts, Charming Grenade, Pretty Boy, and Yuma, Marcos Did, Vicente, Gilberto, Dead Lizard, Lounge, Sam, Ross, Lumpy Spuds, Jerome, Fatboy 619, Sklinny, Nick, Party McButterpants, Blood Angel, Veronis, Baboon, Sean, aka Cert2B, Nathan, and Fast Like a Tortoise. Thank you all very much for your support.